There is a sentence Rob Reiner once used when describing the years his family spent trying to help his son Nick that I have not been able to stop thinking about. Keep him alive until he's 25. Those 6 words tell us something about this family that a list of rehabilitation centers, diagnoses, medications, substances, arrests, or psychiatric interventions never could. Because by the time a parent begins measuring success primarily by whether their child remains alive, the developmental expectations that once defined parenting have fundamentally changed. The question is no longer simply whether your child will graduate from college, develop a career, become financially independent, maintain relationships, or successfully launch into adulthood. The question has contracted into something much more primitive and terrifying. Can I keep my child alive long enough for something to change? Newarker.com. That is where I want to begin this reality case study, because the story of Nick Reiner cannot responsibly be reduced to the horrific allegations that eventually brought this family into the national conversation. Nick Reiner has been charged with murdering his parents, Rob Reiner and Michele Singer Reiner, and has pled not guilty, which means that throughout this episode, we are going to maintain an important boundary between psychological formulation and legal determination. Understanding addiction does not excuse violence. Understanding psychosis does not establish criminal responsibility. Understanding family systems does not mean blaming a family for the behavior of one member. And understanding what may have happened neurologically does not allow us to determine from outside the case precisely what occurred inside Nick's mind at the time his parents were killed. What psychology can do, however, is help us examine the decades that came before that night, because when we look backward, what emerges is not a single catastrophic event appearing out of nowhere. What emerges is a child reportedly struggling with regulation, an adolescent experimenting with substances, a teenager entering treatment, a young man repeatedly cycling through treatment environments, parents becoming increasingly involved in keeping him safe, periods of homelessness and severe substance use, a father and son eventually transforming their conflict into a movie. Later, serious psychiatric illness, reported medication changes, questions about psychosis and possible substance involvement, and siblings who were growing up beside all of it. This is therefore not simply the story of Nick Reiner. This is the story of what can happen to an entire family when one member requires extraordinary intervention for years. Before the drugs. One of the first mistakes we can make when examining severe addiction is beginning the person's psychological history with the first drug, because doing so can inadvertently create the impression that there was a completely regulated child. Substances arrived, and everything that followed was produced by drugs. The available accounts surrounding Nick suggest something considerably more complicated. Alana Zabel, a yoga instructor who worked with the Reiner family beginning in the early 2000s and continued working with them until approximately 2010, has described significant behavioral intensity when Nick was still a child. Zabel recalled conducting yoga sessions with Michele and repeatedly having Nick enter with an urgent problem or meltdown, eventually leading the family to ask her to work with him individually. Those experiences contributed to her children's book, A Chair in the Air, centered around a highly energetic child named Nicky. Learning regulation and responsibility. Zabel subsequently described Rob and Michele as highly involved parents attempting to manage circumstances she characterized as extraordinarily difficult. People.com. I want to be extremely careful here because retrospective diagnosis is tempting and frequently irresponsible. We cannot look backward at childhood meltdowns and declare that Nick had ADHD, autism, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar disorder, or another neurodevelopmental condition simply because those behaviors can occur within those diagnoses. We do not possess his childhood neuropsychological testing or psychiatric records, and behavioral dysregulation is transdiagnostic, meaning it can appear across many different psychological and neurodevelopmental conditions. What the available history does allow us to say is that there are accounts suggesting difficulty with emotional and behavioral regulation existed before his severe substance use history, which means that when substances eventually entered the picture, they may have encountered a nervous system that was already struggling. That matters because one of the questions I constantly want parents to ask when they discover substance use is not merely, how do I get my child to stop? But also, what is the substance doing for my child? Those are two very different questions. Why some neurodivergent young people self-medicate? The self-medication hypothesis describes the possibility that an individual repeatedly uses a substance because its pharmacological effects temporarily alter an internal state that feels uncomfortable, intolerable, or difficult to regulate. That state might involve anxiety, agitation, boredom, insomnia, intrusive thinking, emotional intensity, depression, shame, loneliness, social discomfort, or a chronic feeling of being unable to settle inside one's own nervous system. This phenomenon is particularly important when discussing adolescence with forms of neurodevelopmental vulnerability, or ADHD, because ADHD involves considerably more than attention. It can involve differences in executive functioning, reward processing, inhibitory control, emotional impulsivity, motivational regulation, novelty seeking, and the capacity to tolerate delayed reinforcement. Imagine being 14 years old and repeatedly feeling as though your brain moves faster than your ability to organize it. Your emotions become larger than your ability to regulate them. Boredom feels almost physically intolerable. Rejection hits harder than you can explain. Sleep is difficult, and adults continuously tell you to calm down, focus, stop interrupting, think before acting, or simply try harder. You may not possess the language to say, I am experiencing impaired arousal regulation and executive dysfunction. You know only, I hate feeling like this. Then you smoke marijuana, and something changes. Perhaps your thoughts slow down. Perhaps social discomfort diminishes. Perhaps your body feels calmer. Perhaps you stop caring about whatever had been consuming your attention, or perhaps you finally sleep. Cannabis certainly does not produce those effects in everyone and can worsen anxiety, cognition, paranoia, and psychiatric symptoms in vulnerable people. But if the adolescent experiences relief, the brain has just received an extraordinarily powerful piece of information. Before I did this, I felt bad. After I did this, I felt better. That is learning. This worked last time. Psychology calls one component of this process negative reinforcement, which does not mean punishment. Negative reinforcement means that a behavior becomes increasingly likely because performing it removes or reduces something unpleasant. If marijuana reduces anxiety, using marijuana becomes more likely when anxiety returns. If an opioid reduces emotional pain, using an opioid becomes more likely when emotional pain returns. If alcohol reduces social inhibition, alcohol becomes increasingly associated with social confidence. And if a stimulant produces energy, motivation, or a feeling of competence, that substance can become associated with overcoming fatigue, emptiness, or underactivation. The brain does not require conscious understanding of this process because the nervous system is continuously recording contingencies between behavior and outcome. The brain learns, when I feel this way, this changes it. That sentence is one of the most important things parents can understand about addiction because the addicted brain is not merely remembering the substance. The brain is remembering the solution. Our brains are prediction machines, continuously using previous experiences to anticipate which behaviors are likely to produce desired outcomes. If touching a hot stove produced pain yesterday, the brain predicts pain tomorrow. If calling someone reduced loneliness, social connection becomes one available solution to loneliness. And if a substance rapidly eliminated anxiety, emotional pain, boredom, agitation, or insomnia. The brain stores that behavioral pathway. When distress returns, the nervous system does not start at zero. It remembers. This worked last time. This is where addiction becomes particularly deceptive because the substance frequently appears to work before it begins creating devastation. Parents usually become acutely aware of the drug after consequences have accumulated, by which point they see declining grades, lying, disappearing, financial problems, treatment admissions, psychiatric deterioration, broken relationships, or frightening behavior, and understandably wonder how anyone could continue doing something producing such obvious destruction. The person using the substance, however, possesses an earlier learning history in which the substance reliably produced relief, pleasure, emotional distance, stimulation, sleep, confidence, or escape. Over time, tolerance can develop, meaning repeated exposure produces neuroadaptation, such that the same amount of the substance no longer generates the same effect. The person then confronts an extraordinarily frustrating experience because the brain continues predicting relief from a strategy that is becoming progressively less effective. Instead of automatically abandoning that strategy, the person may increase the amount, increase the frequency, combine substances, or discover another drug capable of producing a stronger or different state change. This is why I prefer a more nuanced explanation than simply calling marijuana a gateway drug. Most adolescents who use marijuana do not progress to opioid or stimulant addiction, and marijuana does not mechanically cause someone to begin using Percocet. What can progress is the strategy of chemical state regulation. When I cannot tolerate what I am feeling, I change what I am feeling chemically. From marijuana to Percocet, public reporting places, Nick's experimentation with marijuana around the end of 8th grade and describes subsequent use of pills, including Percocet, during adolescence. Percocet contains oxycodone, an opioid capable of producing analgesia, relaxation, euphoria, sedation, and powerful temporary relief from both physical and subjective emotional distress. WashingtonPost.com. For a psychologically vulnerable adolescent, the internal experience may not be, I have discovered an opioid with enormous addiction potential. It may simply be, I finally feel okay. That is an extraordinarily powerful reinforcer. As repeated opioid exposure progresses, the motivational structure can eventually shift from using primarily to feel good toward using to avoid feeling bad, because dependence can create withdrawal, agitation, dysphoria, anxiety, insomnia, craving, and physical discomfort. The substance that initially solved an internal problem can therefore begin generating additional problems that the same substance temporarily relieves, creating a vicious behavioral loop in which the individual may eventually be using not to recreate the original euphoria, but simply to approximate normal functioning. This is the moment when "why don't you just stop" becomes neuropsychologically inadequate. The person may desperately want the consequences to stop while simultaneously possessing a nervous system that has spent years learning that the substance is the fastest available mechanism for changing an intolerable internal state. What early substance use can interrupt developmentally. When substance use begins around 14 or 15, another issue enters the picture because adolescence is not merely the period between childhood and adulthood. It is an intensive period of executive, emotional, social, and identity development. Adolescents are supposed to accumulate thousands of experiences in which they discover that boredom can be survived, rejection does not destroy them, anxiety eventually decreases, anger can be regulated, sleep can be managed, responsibilities can be completed despite low motivation, conflicts can be repaired, and discomfort does not always require immediate escape. Psychologist Albert Bandura described self-efficacy as the belief that we possess the ability to act effectively in situations that matter, and self-efficacy develops substantially through mastery experiences in which we encounter difficulty, do something about it, and discover through lived experience. I handled that. When substances repeatedly perform the regulatory function, some of those mastery repetitions can be displaced. Anxiety occurs and marijuana regulates it. Emotional pain occurs and an opioid regulates it. Severe addiction develops and treatment regulates the environment. Discharge occurs and parents begin regulating transportation, money, housing, appointments, medication, and sobriety. Destabilization follows, and another institution supplies structure again. Chronological age continues moving forward, but opportunities to practice independent regulation can become fragmented. Then treatment becomes part of development. Rob Reiner told The New Yorker in 2016 that Nick had been in and out of rehab from ages 15 to 19, with programs extending from Montana to New Jersey, while later, investigative reporting reconstructed a history involving at least 18 treatment facilities paid for by his parents by his mid-20s. NewYorker.com, WashingtonPost.com. The publicly identified programs include Visions in Malibu, Second Nature in Utah, Summit Preparatory School in Montana, Alena Lodge in New Jersey, and Burning Tree Ranch in Texas, among others. The first reported placement, Visions, occurred during adolescence after his parents learned about his pill use. Current estimates published by Recovery.com place a standard 45-day residential stay at Visions at approximately $105,000, although that is a contemporary estimate and absolutely should not be represented as what the Reiners paid at the time. Recovery.com. For perspective only, 17 hypothetical stays at today's $105,000 price would equal approximately $1.785 million, while 18 comparable stays would approach $1.89 million, and even that would exclude psychiatric care, medication, emergency services, interventions, transportation, family therapy, sober living, legal costs, and other services. We cannot estimate the Reiners' actual expenditure from those numbers, but they allow us to appreciate the scale of repeated private residential intervention. The financial cost, however, may be the least psychologically interesting resource being spent. Time was being spent. Attention was being spent. Emotional bandwidth was being spent. A former roommate reportedly remembered Rob and Michele attending every weekend family session at Visions and said they really never, ever gave up on him. Other reporting similarly portrays parents repeatedly returning to treatment and intervention over many years. WashingtonPost.com. The cycle that can take over a family. Now look at the sequence not as 17 separate treatment admissions, but as a repeating system. Destabilization to parental alarm, to intervention, to treatment placement, to external structure, to stabilization, to discharge, to return to ordinary life, to loss of structure, to relapse or psychiatric destabilization, leads to parental alarm, leads to another intervention, leads to another placement. Every repetition teaches everyone something. The struggling young person learns that when functioning collapses, an external system eventually arrives to organize life. The parents learn that when functioning begins deteriorating, failing to intervene may have catastrophic consequences. The treatment program supplies structure. The person improves. The family feels hope. The person leaves. The scaffolding disappears. Ordinary life demands self-initiation, frustration tolerance, planning, inhibition, medication adherence, sobriety, employment, sleep regulation, money management, and relationships. And suddenly, the very capacities that were externally supported inside treatment have to be internally generated. If those capacities are insufficient, the cycle begins again. This is where Bowen family systems theory becomes enormously useful because we can begin examining overfunctioning and underfunctioning reciprocity. When one family member repeatedly struggles to manage essential functions, another member frequently compensates by doing more. And in families dealing with potentially lethal addiction or psychosis, that overfunctioning can be entirely understandable because the alternative may feel like allowing a child to die. Parents organize treatment, make appointments, pay bills, arrange transportation, locate housing, monitor medication, communicate with professionals, establish boundaries, rescue after crises, and then repeat the process because experience has taught them that intervention may be necessary for survival. The problem is that the more dangerous the young person's underfunctioning becomes, the more difficult it becomes for parents to permit the experiences through which independent functioning ordinarily develops. Keep him alive until he's 25. This brings us back to Rob's extraordinary sentence. Keep him alive until he's 25. Rob described carrying that idea during the years when Nick's addiction was severe, while Nick later dismissed it as arbitrary and ridiculous. Newarker.com. Those two responses to the same sentence capture the relational tragedy beautifully, because Rob could experience that belief as love, terror, responsibility, and determination, while Nick could experience it as infantilization and evidence that his father did not believe he was capable of directing his own life. Protection to one person can feel like control to another, and both people can sincerely believe their interpretation. Then they made Being Charlie. Nick eventually met Matt Elisifan in treatment, and together they wrote what became Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical story about addiction, treatment, and a deeply conflicted father-son relationship. Then something psychologically remarkable happened. Rob Reiner directed it. The father and son who had spent years fighting about addiction, treatment, autonomy, and what Nick needed effectively moved their conflict into a screenplay and began working on it together. Rob subsequently described making the film as being like being in therapy with him and said that through the process, he learned how to be Nick's father. He acknowledged that fear had driven many of his earlier decisions and reflected that he and Michele had sometimes attempted to mold Nick rather than sufficiently appreciate his individual temperament. NewYorker.com. One of the most psychologically revealing elements emerged when they repeatedly rewrote the final father-son scene until Nick arrived at Charlie's line, "I don't hate you." Not "you were right." Not "I forgive you." Not "thank you for saving me." Not even "I love you." "I don't hate you." That restrained resolution tells us something about how complicated the relationship remained even during a period that appeared to contain meaningful reconciliation. What years of substance use can do to the brain. Repeated substance exposure can progressively alter neural systems involved in reward, motivation, salience, stress regulation, executive control, learning, memory, and behavioral inhibition, although effects vary substantially according to the drug, dose, frequency, duration, age of onset, genetics, sleep, psychiatric vulnerability, nutrition, and periods of abstinence. I would avoid telling listeners that drugs simply destroy the brain, because the brain remains neuroplastic and meaningful recovery can occur. A more accurate description is that repeated drug exposure can train the brain to assign disproportionate motivational importance to substances and substance-associated cues. Dopamine becomes particularly important because dopamine is not simply a pleasure chemical. It participates in reward prediction, motivation, reinforcement learning, and salience, meaning the brain's determination that something matters and deserves attention. Over time, the drug itself is not the only thing that becomes neurologically meaningful, because the person, place, emotional state, argument, neighborhood, song, smell, time of day, or relationship associated with previous drug use can become a conditioned cue capable of activating craving. This explains something families often find incomprehensible. Someone can know exactly what the drug has cost them and still want it. Knowing and wanting are not controlled by identical systems. Knowing and doing are not identical functions, and remembering the consequences does not automatically erase the nervous system's memory of relief. Then psychiatric illness enters the picture. Nick was later reportedly diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, and at one point was placed under a mental health conservatorship. That creates a much more complicated clinical picture, because now a family and treatment team may be attempting to differentiate among substance intoxication, withdrawal, medication effects, sleep deprivation, chronic substance-related changes, mood symptoms, and a primary psychotic spectrum disorder. Psychosis involves impairment in reality testing, meaning that the person's interpretation of events may no longer reliably correspond with consensual external reality. Hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, disorganized thinking, and profound suspiciousness can occur. And persecutory delusions become especially concerning because ordinary parental interventions can acquire completely different meanings. A parent says, "We need to get you evaluated." The parent's meaning may be, "I am terrified and trying to keep you safe." The psychotic interpretation could potentially become, "You are conspiring to imprison me." A parent says, "We aren't giving you money while you're using." The parent's meaning may be, "We are establishing a safety boundary." A paranoid interpretation might become, "You are controlling me and trying to destroy me." The event remains identical. The assigned meaning changes, and human behavior responds powerfully to perceived meaning. The medication change. This brings us to an important development preceding Rob and Michele's deaths. Public reporting indicates that Nick's psychiatric medication regimen was changed approximately 3 to 4 weeks, roughly 1 month before the killings, rather than 1 week before, with reports indicating that concern about weight gain was involved in the medication issue. We need to be extremely cautious here because we do not possess Nick's medical chart, the precise medication regimen, dosage information, adherence history, or cross-titration schedule, which means we cannot claim that a medication change caused subsequent behavior. The issue, nevertheless, raises an important clinical problem because some antipsychotic medications can produce substantial weight gain, metabolic effects, sedation, emotional flattening, or a subjective sense of cognitive and physical slowing. Patients sometimes describe feeling as though they are moving through life in slow motion or no longer feel like themselves. And after stabilization, a particularly dangerous thought can emerge. "I'm okay now. Why am I still taking this?" The paradox is that the person may feel okay because the treatment is working. If insight is limited, the causal relationship can be misinterpreted. "I'm no longer psychotic, therefore I don't need medication." Instead of, "I'm no longer psychotic because the medication is suppressing symptoms." In schizophrenia spectrum illnesses, anosognosia, meaning impaired awareness of illness, can further complicate adherence because the person may genuinely have diminished capacity to recognize that their perceptions or beliefs are symptoms requiring treatment. The descent. This is where Dr. Drew Pinsky's description of the descent becomes useful, because psychiatric destabilization does not necessarily occur like flipping a switch. Sleep can begin deteriorating, irritability can increase, suspiciousness can intensify, ordinary events can acquire unusual significance, thoughts can become less organized, relationships become increasingly adversarial, and insight can decline. That creates a devastating paradox. The family can become increasingly certain something is wrong at precisely the same time the affected person becomes increasingly certain the family is wrong. And the people attempting to intervene can themselves become incorporated into a paranoid interpretation of reality. Dr. Drew and the methamphetamine question. Dr. Drew has publicly raised the possibility of methamphetamine-associated psychosis in discussing the Reiner case, but this is an area where we must maintain an especially firm evidentiary boundary because publicly available information does not establish that Nick was using methamphetamine at the time of his parents' deaths. Dr. Drew's position should therefore be presented as a clinical hypothesis, not a toxicological finding. The mechanism he is discussing, however, is medically important. Methamphetamine can produce profound increases in arousal and dopamine signaling, and particularly with heavy exposure and prolonged sleep deprivation, can contribute to paranoia, hallucinations, persecutory delusions, agitation, disorganized thinking, and impaired reality testing. Methamphetamine-associated psychosis can sometimes resemble schizophrenia closely enough that clinicians must carefully establish the temporal relationship among drug exposure, symptoms, abstinence, and recurrence before determining whether they are looking at a substance-induced psychosis, a primary psychotic disorder, or both processes interacting. If future toxicology, medical records, or court evidence were to establish stimulant exposure near the time of the killings, then clinicians would need to consider a remarkably complicated risk architecture involving a schizophrenia spectrum illness, medication transition, possible stimulant exposure, sleep disruption, decades of substance use disorder, impaired reality testing, and escalating interpersonal conflict rather than declaring that any single variable caused the alleged violence. And then there are the siblings. This is the part of the Reiner story I find myself returning to because Nick was not an only child, and families do not experience severe addiction and psychiatric illness exclusively through the relationship between the identified person and the parents. Jake and Romy were developing inside the same family system while enormous amounts of time, attention, fear, money, professional consultation, and emotional bandwidth were being directed toward Nick. We cannot responsibly declare Jake or Romy neurotypical because their private neurodevelopmental or psychiatric histories are not ours to diagnose, but we can say that there is no comparable publicly documented history involving repeated rehabilitation, severe addiction, homelessness, psychosis, conservatorship, or recurrent functional collapse. Whatever their private psychological experiences may have been, Nick appears to have required a profoundly different level of family intervention. This introduces what I call asymmetrical parental allocation, meaning that when one child's needs repeatedly become dangerous, the family's finite resources naturally become disproportionately directed toward that child. Money may have been a resource the Reiners possessed in abundance. Time was not. Emotional bandwidth was not. Parental attention was not. There are still only 24 hours in Rob's day and 24 hours in Michelle's day. If one child is missing from treatment while another child needs to discuss an ordinary developmental problem, the missing child wins. If one child may be using opioids while another wants dad's attention, the potential overdose wins. If another treatment program needs to be researched while another sibling has something happening at school, the crisis frequently wins. That does not mean parents love the other children less. It means danger reorganizes attention. What is it like to be the sibling? We should not assign Jake or Romy emotions they have not publicly described, but we can ask the family systems question. What is it like to grow up beside the child everyone is trying to keep alive? What is it like when mom and dad are attending another treatment meeting? What happens when another program is being discussed? What happens when your brother comes home again? What happens when he relapses? What happens when another psychiatric crisis changes the emotional climate of the house? What happens to your own problems when your siblings' problems can become life-threatening? What happens when you learn that being the child who is okay makes life easier for your parents? And what happens decades later when the brother your parents spent so much of their lives trying to save is accused of taking both of their lives? After Rob and Michele. Jake and Romy's initial public statements centered their parents, describing Rob and Michele as not merely their parents, but their best friends. Jake later described his post-loss existence as a living nightmare and wrote that the family had lost more than half of itself in the most violent way imaginable. Those words are psychologically remarkable because they describe more than parental bereavement. They suggest the destruction of an entire family configuration. The surviving siblings have lost their mother. They have lost their father. They have lost the family that existed before the killings. And regardless of what ultimately happens legally, their relationship with their brother can never simply return to what it was before. That is compound relational loss. Would Rob and Michele still have loved their son? Dr. Drew has raised another profoundly uncomfortable question. If Rob and Michele could somehow respond to what happened, would they simply want Nick discarded, or would some part of them still experience him as their child? We cannot answer that question for them, but psychology tells us something important about parental attachment. Love, terror, anger, grief, betrayal, and demands for accountability are capable of existing simultaneously. A parent can believe what you did is horrific. You must be held accountable. I am afraid of you. I cannot allow you near me. I am devastated by you. And still experience, you are my child. After decades apparently spent trying to keep Nick alive, there is no reason to assume parental attachment would simply have disappeared because something horrific occurred, just as there is no reason to assume love would have meant minimizing responsibility. And Jake and Romy occupy an entirely different position. Siblings are not substitute parents. Whatever caregiving role Rob and Michele occupied does not automatically transfer to their surviving children. The question I cannot stop thinking about. When I put this history together, I do not see a simple story about marijuana, Percocet, schizophrenia, methamphetamine, medication, wealthy parents, or rehabilitation. I see accumulation. I see reports of childhood dysregulation followed by adolescent substance experimentation, the discovery that chemicals could rapidly change internal states, reinforcement learning teaching the brain this worked last time, tolerance making the original solution progressively less effective, escalation into other substances, treatment beginning during adolescence, repeated residential placements, interrupting ordinary developmental experiences, parents becoming increasingly responsible for keeping their child functioning, a young man simultaneously needing and resenting that involvement, a father eventually saying his objective was simply to keep his son alive until 25, and a father and son attempting to metabolize years of conflict through a movie they created together. Then serious psychiatric illness enters the picture, then medication management, and then questions about psychosis, then a reported medication change. Then Dr. Drew raises the possibility of stimulant-associated psychosis. Then Rob and Michele are killed, and two siblings are left standing inside what remains of the family. That is not one psychological phenomenon. That is an entire developmental and family ecosystem. The psychology I break down does not excuse behavior. Hopefully, psychology helps us understand behavior more accurately. Understanding why an adolescent self-medicates does not make substance use safe. Understanding addiction does not remove personal responsibility. Understanding schizophrenia does not equate schizophrenia with violence. Understanding psychosis does not tell us what happened inside Nick Reiner's mind on one particular night. Understanding parental overfunctioning does not mean Rob and Michele caused their sons difficulties, and understanding sibling adaptation does not allow us to decide what Jake or Romy should feel about their brother. What it allows us to see is something considerably more important. Families make decisions from inside the story, not from the ending. Rob and Michele did not have the information we possess while looking backward. They made decisions when Nick was 15. They made another decision after another relapse. They made another when a professional recommended another program. They made another when he came home. They made another when he was homeless. They made another when psychiatric illness entered the picture. They made another when medication became complicated. And presumably, after every frightening episode, they carried considerably more fear into the next decision than they had carried into the previous one. That is how family systems develop. The brain learns, this worked last time. The parents learn. Last time we didn't intervene quickly enough, something terrible happened. The child learns. When everything falls apart, something outside me eventually regulates it. The siblings learn their own ways of surviving beside it. And eventually, everybody is responding not simply to what is happening today, but to everything that has happened before today. Perhaps that is the psychological question underneath part 1 of the Reiner family story. What happens when a family spends decades trying to save one of its members, while the very process of saving him progressively becomes part of the family structure? Because sometimes love looks like holding on. Sometimes treatment is absolutely life-saving. Sometimes boundaries are necessary. Sometimes parents have to intervene. Sometimes a young adult desperately needs autonomy. And sometimes a family confronting severe addiction and psychiatric illness is forced to choose among options in which none of the choices feels completely safe. Rob Reiner once reduced his objective to 6 words: keep him alive until he's 25. The tragedy of this story is that his son survived 25, and the family crisis did not end there. Part 2, when one child becomes the center of the family system. Before we close, I want to remind you that Reality Case Studies is a psychoeducational series, and everything discussed in this episode is based upon publicly available reporting, interviews, statements, and other publicly accessible information. I have never evaluated or treated Nick Reiner, Rob Reiner, Michele Singer Reiner, Jake Reiner, Romy Reiner, or any member of this family, and I do not have access to their private medical records, psychiatric records, toxicology results, treatment records, medication history, neuropsychological testing, or private family communications. Therefore, when I use psychological concepts such as self-medication, negative reinforcement, addiction, executive functioning, psychosis, anosognosia, overfunctioning and underfunctioning, or Bowen family systems theory, I am using those concepts as educational frameworks through which we can better understand patterns that occur in individuals and families generally, rather than diagnosing any person discussed in this episode. What I want you to carry from episode 1 is therefore something larger than the story of one young man or one famous family. When a young person discovers that marijuana, an opioid, alcohol, a stimulant, or another substance can rapidly change an internal state they have struggled to regulate, the nervous system begins learning a behavioral solution. This worked last time becomes encoded through reinforcement learning, and as tolerance, dependence, withdrawal, psychiatric vulnerability, disrupted development, and repeated treatment accumulate, what began as an attempt to feel different can gradually become an entire architecture around which life is organized. Then the family begins learning too. The parent learns, when I intervene, the immediate danger decreases. The sibling learns, my problem can wait because this problem cannot. The struggling child may learn, when everything collapses, somebody or some institution eventually arrives to regulate what I cannot regulate myself. None of these lessons requires anyone to consciously choose the family pattern. They can emerge incrementally through hundreds of attempts to survive the next crisis. That is where Bowen family systems theory becomes so useful, because Bowen asks us to stop looking exclusively at the symptomatic individual and begin examining the reciprocal emotional processes surrounding that individual. If one person becomes increasingly unstable, everyone else adapts. Mom changes, dad changes, siblings change, rules change, expectations change, money moves, time moves, conversations move, holidays change. Family decisions begin accounting for the possibility of another crisis, and eventually, the family can become organized around anticipating, preventing, managing, and recovering from the instability of one member. This does not mean that family adaptation caused the addiction or psychiatric illness. It means that chronic instability has gravitational force inside a family system, and everyone living near it has to develop some way of responding, and that is precisely where we are going next. The Reiner family, part 2. When one child becomes the center of the family system in episode 2, we are going to move the camera away from Nick as an individual and widen the frame to the entire Reiner family system. Because after years of addiction, treatment placements, relapse, psychiatric instability, homelessness, medication concerns, and repeated parental intervention, an important question emerges. At what point does a family stop merely responding to one member's crises and begin reorganizing itself around them? This is where we are going to introduce the Bowen Family Systems concept of the identified patient, the family member, whose visible symptoms become the primary location of the family's concern and intervention. Importantly, calling someone the identified patient does not mean the family caused that person's illness. It means that one person's symptoms can become so consequential that the emotional functioning of the entire family increasingly organizes itself in response. We are also going to examine family homeostasis, which describes the tendency of systems to develop familiar patterns and then resist changes to those patterns, even when the patterns themselves are painful. We will look at parental hypervigilance, the nervous system adaptation that can occur when parents have repeatedly learned that a missed phone call, unusual behavior, disappearing money, several nights without sleep, a change in speech, or a child failing to come home can precede a genuine crisis. After enough frightening experiences, a parent does not respond only to today's missed phone call. The parent's nervous system responds to every previous missed phone call that ended badly. That is how chronic crisis can change parenting itself. Then I want to go much deeper into overfunctioning and underfunctioning reciprocity, because this is one of the most important Bowen concepts for parents of adolescents and emerging adults. When one family member chronically struggles to initiate, organize, plan, tolerate consequences, maintain employment, manage money, remain sober, adhere to medication, or complete ordinary developmental responsibilities, another family member frequently begins compensating. The parent schedules, reminds, pays, drives, researches, negotiates, rescues, calls, monitors, locates, organizes, and intervenes, often for extraordinarily understandable reasons. Yet over time, a painful reciprocal process can develop in which the more one person functions for another, the fewer opportunities the other person has to experience the mastery, frustration, consequences, and repetition through which autonomous functioning ordinarily develops. The rescue may solve today's crisis while unintentionally complicating tomorrow's development, which is what I want to explore as the rescue paradox. We are also going to examine developmental opportunity cost, meaning what may not get practiced when adolescence and emerging adulthood are repeatedly interrupted by substance use, psychiatric crises, residential placements, wilderness programs, sober living, hospitalization, relapse, and recovery. Chronological age keeps advancing while opportunities to practice ordinary adulthood, getting yourself somewhere on time, tolerating a terrible boss, repairing a friendship, managing money, waking up when nobody makes you, failing a class and figuring out what comes next, living through boredom without chemically escaping it, can become fragmented. A 25-year-old can therefore possess 25 years of chronological life without necessarily having accumulated the same number of independent mastery experiences as another 25-year-old whose adolescence and early adulthood unfolded under very different conditions. And we are going to talk about the siblings, because when one child becomes the family emergency, the other children do not stop developing. We will examine asymmetrical parental allocation, sibling adaptation, possible parentification, the psychological role of becoming the child who is fine, and what happens when one sibling learns, without anybody ever explicitly saying it, that mom and dad already have enough to worry about. We will not diagnose Jake or Romy or assign emotions they have never publicly described, but we can use family systems science to ask what it can mean developmentally to grow up beside a sibling whose needs repeatedly command extraordinary amounts of parental attention and emotional energy. Finally, we are going to confront what I call The privilege paradox. Having extraordinary financial resources can give a family access to treatment, specialists, residential programs, transportation, legal assistance, housing, and repeated second chances that many families could never afford, while money still cannot purchase insight, medication adherence, sobriety, psychological readiness, executive functioning, or the internal motivation required for sustained change. Sometimes greater resources allow a family to keep intervening far longer than another family could, which can be life-saving. However, it can also postpone the moment when everyone has to confront a brutal reality. There are limits to what one person can do for another person, regardless of how much they love them or how many resources they possess. So join me for the Reiner family. Part 2. When one child becomes the center of the family system, where we are going to examine what chronic crisis does, not only to the child who is struggling, but to the parents who keep trying to save them, the siblings growing up beside them, and the emotional architecture of the family itself. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist, integrative mental health practitioner, and family systems coach, and this is the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. Until next time, dear reality TV lover, we will keep putting on the therapist's glasses, not to excuse behavior and not to diagnose people we have never treated, but to understand the psychology underneath the story and ask what someone else's story might teach us about our own.